All right, so this is for U.S. history. This is NTI, I think it's 12. This will be for Friday, and that would be March, what will be the 27th. And so today we're going to be starting the Cold War, really before spring break. So all of next week we'll go up through the 1950s version of Cold War. I'll also talk about, what's life like at home during the 1950s, and then come back and kind of get into the 60s part of the Cold War. So first we have to look at what was the Cold War. The Cold War is going to be this. It's not a war in terms of like World War I and World War II. It's kind of a proxy war, okay? Where the United States and the Soviet Union are basically fighting for influence across the globe. So it lasts from 1945 until about 1991. And while there's no direct war between the United States and the Soviet Union, there are wars where the U.S. or the Soviet Union get involved and we help out the other side. Korea, Vietnam are a couple good examples. And the reason why we have this conflict is we're two completely different countries. The United States is a democratic country. The Soviet Union is a communist country. We favor capitalism. They favor communism. We favor free elections. They favor putting the party in charge. We have economic and religious freedom. We have the ability to own our own private property. In the Soviet Union, there is no private property. Everything is owned by the government. And the idea is everyone is going to be treated equally. They're all, it doesn't matter if you're a farmer or if you're a doctor or if you're a whatever. Everyone's supposed to be the same. So in the United States, we kind of respect the individual and their choices they make. In communism, it's kind of like the group is more important. So, Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, he doesn't really get a lot of thanks from his country much longer after the war. He gets voted out of office only a few months after the war. So after he's no longer Prime Minister, he runs across Europe and the United States, basically warning of the next issue. He's like, yes, we have defeated the Nazis, and that's big. But the next big issue for Europe and the world is communism in the Soviet Union. And he delivers the famous Iron Curtain speech, where he says, from the Setland in the Baltic to the Tristes in the Adriatic, an Iron Curtain has descended across the continent. What that means, basically, Western Europe is going to be free, democratic Europe. Eastern Europe, the ones you can see in the red, that's going to be communist Europe. And so basically, we have, the West versus the East. And from 1945 until about 91, that is the difference between the two countries, or the two sides. So, the first thing before we dive into this fighting against communism, we have to kind of shape the world after World War II. So, the Yalta Conference, which was in April of 1945, is the last meeting of the Big Three. And the reason why it's the last meeting, FDR dies shortly after the Yalta Conference. But basically, they decide two things. The first thing they decide is what we're going to do to make sure that the world is secure and doesn't fall into another world war, and that's the development of the United Nations, which is what the League of Nations was supposed to be, but the U.S. is going to join it. Basically, every single country around the world has some sort of representation in the United Nations. Still exists today. And basically, when you have international problems, instead of fighting them out, you take them to the United Nations, and the United Nations, all the countries deliberate them as a whole, and they decide what's the best movement for the world going forward. They also decided, what do we do with Germany? Okay, last time we just kind of punished Germany, made them accept the war guilt clause, and then we kind of left them on their own. They were in mass economic, inflation, and they had terrible unemployment. And all of a sudden, this Hitler guy comes into power. He's saying things that people like to say. He becomes an autocratic leader, and obviously the rest is history. So, one of the first things we have to do is, what do we do with these war criminals, these Nazi war criminals that have been captured? Now, Hitler commits suicide. Heinrich Himmler, the number 2 of Nazi Germany, he also commits suicide. So, several of the leaders have committed suicide. But the ones that we have captured, what do we do with them? So 22 high-ranking Nazi officials were captured. 12 of them are sentenced to death. 7 are sentenced to long prison sentences, and the other 3, I can't remember specifically what happened to them, if they were let go or if they had shorter sentences. But basically, it was the world putting Nazi Germany on trial. And a lot of them claimed, though, we didn't know what was going on in the concentration camps. That was a Hitler and Himmler thing. Or they were just claiming, well, look, I was just following orders, and if I didn't follow orders, I'd be shot and killed, or whatever. And so this was supposed to kind of bring justice, whatever justice could be brought, thanks to the Holocaust. And it was led by the Soviet Union, the United States, France, Great Britain, and other countries were involved as well. And it was meant to be, a way to hold those accountable so we could kind of try to put World War II behind us and try to move forward. So the big thing, and kind of where you could argue, I always argue the start of the Cold War happens after the Battle for the Bulge, when the Soviet Union and the United States are racing to Berlin to see who can capture Berlin first. The second thing is, how do we divide up Germany after the war? So Germany is divided basically into East Berlin and West Berlin, or East Germany and West Germany. Okay, the Soviet Union, the red, they get the eastern half. Then the United States, France, and Great Britain, they get the western half. Now you're like, you look at that. Obviously, more territory was given to the west, but more population was in the east, mainly because the capital Berlin was also in the east. And so what they did with Berlin, they also divided Berlin into East and West Berlin. In Berlin, we're going to kind of talk about later, is going to be symbolic of the Cold War in and of itself, because it's so close and it's so distinctly different between the free part of Europe and the communist part of Europe. So, containment policy. How are we going to deal with communism? So remember, FDR dies. Harry Truman is now president. Harry Truman was vice president. He's the last president we've had that did not go to college. He was a farmer, and then he was the governor of Missouri. Of course, he was made vice president, kind of attract people from the Midwest. And then, of course, FDR dies, and boom, he becomes president. So, the policy that that Truman in the United States is going to consider is called containment. And what that means is containment, you kind of think about like what we're going through right now with the coronavirus. You're trying to contain in this case, communism, where it's at, okay? You don't want it to spread. You don't want other countries to become infected and for, communism to get bigger and bigger, just like today. We don't want the coronavirus to spread. That's why we're kind of all on self-quarantine right now. We're trying to stop the spread of this disease, so it's easier to combat. We're trying to stop the spread of communism, so it's easier to combat. So, Harry Truman issues something known as the Truman Doctrine, which basically says the United States is going to lend economic aid to any country that's facing violence from outside pressures, which basically means they're facing, communist revolutionaries. So, while communism only really takes place in Eastern Europe, Western Europe, there are several, small communist parties or communist minorities that try to, start communist revolutions in countries in Western Europe. So, one of the first acts of Truman in containing communism is to give money to Greece and Turkey to fight against communist revolutions. They're successful in doing that, and so this is kind of viewed as, the first point. We want to talk about who's winning the Cold War. The United States kind of gets an early advantage in that they stop the spread of communism to Greece and Turkey. Secondly, the United States develops a formal plan known as the Marshall Plan. And basically what the Marshall Plan was is the United States would send billions of dollars to Western Europe to allow them to rebuild themselves. So obviously this is where World War II was taking place. There was tons of damage that was inflicted. And so the United States was basically giving loans, and in some cases they were grants that were given to other countries where they'd use that money to rebuild themselves, try to get their economies back up and running after the catastrophe of World War II. And kind of the plan is the United States is like, okay, Europe, we're going to give you this money, but in return, you have to promise not to give in to communism. Meaning you can't become a communist country, okay? And so that's kind of the plan that the United States makes with Europe, and that's why Western Europe remains so anti-Soviet Union and pro-United States, is because of this relationship that's established in the Marshall Plan. One of the first big conflicts that takes place during the Cold War is the Berlin Airlift. Okay, so Berlin is the capital of Germany. Germany is now two separate countries. Okay, you have East Germany and West Germany. West Germany, that's the U.S., France, Britain occupied portion of Germany. It's going to be a free democratic state. East Germany, that's the Soviet occupied country. So they're obviously going to favor communism. However, Berlin is inside of East Germany, and in itself is split up into East and West Berlin. East Berlin being communist, West Berlin being free democratic. So Stalin gets mad at the United States and West Europe for basically forming a coalition against Eastern Europe. And so they basically block off the city of Berlin from receiving any sort of materials from the outside world until the Soviet Union can be considered an equal player in all the world's affairs. So the United States is like, all right, well, we can't invade East Germany, right? That'd basically provoke us into another world war. So how do we do this? The United States, look, we're just going to fly planes over Berlin, and we're going to drop off, millions of tons of supplies. You're talking water, you're talking food, all sorts of things that were dropped off. And basically, they are saying, like, hey, they're kind of daring the Soviet Union. You shoot down these planes that are carrying supplies for the people of Berlin, right? And see how the rest of the world views you when you shoot down those planes. So it lasts about a year. Eventually, Stalin decides, you know what? This obviously is not working for us. This is making us look bad. And they lift the blockade in May of 1949. So this is kind of seen as the first, hot part of the Cold War, okay? What I mean by the hot part, I mean that's points where, conflict is rising, okay? While the Cold War is kind of, this big idea war between communism and capitalism in the United States and the Soviet Union, there are many points in the Cold War where it gets really hot, where conflicts are close to rising or do arise. And the Berlin Airlift is kind of the first example when things get really hot because, we can't just leave these people of Berlin starving, but we also didn't want to give up Berlin to the Soviets because that would give them a huge advantage in the population control in Germany. And so we decide on this airlift. It becomes very successful. The Soviets eventually give up, and the rest is history. All right, so that will stop us for this week. Hope you all have a good week. Next week we'll pick up with the rest of the 1950s Cold War and 1950s living, and then we'll get into spring break. Hope to see you all soon. Hope you all are staying safe and healthy.